So there's been some developments in the Nintendo Palworld lawsuit, which are quite revealing in terms of Nintendo's strategy and what they're trying to do with this lawsuit. Because they're one of the industry's biggest players, if they're successful, it could have big consequences. We now know that Nintendo is suing the creators of Palworld, not for copyright infringement, but for violating patent law. And we know how much money they're suing them for, and it's a surprising figure. This is such an interesting situation for a number of reasons, raising important questions about creativity, property, the law, about when creativity becomes theft, who should get to own or have exclusive rights over what, as well as philosophical questions about intellectual property. We'll be getting into all of this in this video, but one thing that's especially central to this case is the idea of patenting game mechanics, which I'm going to argue is wrong, dangerous for the future of the industry, and shouldn't be allowed. The Nintendo Palworld situation is something I'm guessing most of you will be aware of somehow. Feel free to skip ahead if you are, but for anyone who isn't, earlier in the year a company called Pocket released Palworld, which has sold 25 million copies since, one of the best-selling PC games of 2024. For obvious reasons, Palworld quickly earned itself the nickname Pokémon with Guns. It's a survival game which takes place in a world filled with numerous colourful animal or monster-like creatures called pals, which you can do battle with and capture. You then use your pals in battle or for traversing the world, or you can enslave them for manual labour back at your base. While it's a very different game from the Pokémon series, the core monster catching and battling gameplay certainly has a strong Pokémon element to it. But there are several other monster catching and battling games out there. Games like Monster Sanctuary and Cyrilym Ultimate also make use of a similar formula. So what's the problem? Well, beyond the core gameplay loop, the similarities between Palworld's pals and actual Pokémon are striking to say the least. An article in IGN called Palworld vs Pokémon: Just How Similar Are the Designs includes a series of almost 40 images comparing the pals with various Pokémon, and the results speak for themselves. Many of them seem like obvious, blatant Pokémon rip-offs. Representatives of Pocket Pair, the company behind Palworld, said the game had cleared legal checks, but the whole thing blew up, and I think it was fairly obvious to everyone in the industry that Nintendo wasn't going to stand for this. Nintendo are a famously litigious company. They send lawyers after people all the time. They've had numerous lawsuits over the years, most of which they win, and have been fiercely protective of their intellectual property. So I think most people following the situation kind of expected a response from them to such a blatant abuse of their copyright, because you know Pokémon is heavily copyrighted. Nintendo announced that they were filing a lawsuit against Pocket Pair back in September, but, and this is where things get interesting, is in the fact that this lawsuit wasn't for copyright infringement, it was for violating a patent. It has recently come to light exactly what patents are involved, as well as how much money Nintendo is suing Palworld's creators for. Pocket Pair has recently announced that Nintendo are demanding 10 million yen from them, which is about $65,000. You heard that right, 65,000. I checked it and everything. 10 million Japanese yen equates to roughly 65,000 US dollars. I think it's actually 65,500, but roughly 65,000. To be clear, for Nintendo, that's nothing. They're worth $62 billion. They make over $10 billion in revenue each year. In the grand scheme of things, 65 grand doesn't mean that much to them. So why are they suing Pocket Pair for such a small amount of money? And why are they suing them for violating patents rather than copyright infringement? I think obviously part of this is that they want to send a message, not only to Pocket Pair, but to anyone else who would dare mess with their intellectual property. Don't do it, or we'll give you a legal headache, or maybe shut you down. But I think there's more going on here, and that this lawsuit is part of a wider strategy for Nintendo, more about the long term than the short term. So let's take a look at what exactly they're suing Palworld for, which is patent infringement. Basically, patents are given to inventors and their inventions. The idea is that if you invent something new, original, and innovative, you can get exclusive rights to profit off that invention for a limited time, typically 20 years. In exchange, you have to publicly declare that patent and publicly explain in legal documentation what the invention is, how you made it, and how it works. A patent is basically a deal you make with a government where you say, I've got this great invention and I want to be the only person profiting off it for a while. And the government says, okay, if you make all the knowledge behind it public, you can be the only one to profit off it for 20 years. Then it goes into the public domain. For the duration of the patent, it is illegal for anyone else to profit off that thing. But once the patent expires, people can use it as they want. Some famous examples of things that have been patented include the electric light bulb, the telephone, the internal combustion engine, and Bluetooth. Nintendo and other game companies have been patenting game mechanics for years. Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War's fantastic Nemesis system, where a hierarchical network of randomized enemies is generated in which these enemies will remember and react dynamically to your actions, is patented. Mass Effect's dialogue wheel is patented. Splinter Cell's last known position mechanic is patented. The objective arrow in Crazy Taxi is patented, and they once sued The Simpsons Road Rage for violating it. Nintendo have 32 patents just for mechanics used in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. So Nintendo are suing Palworld over a collection of 3 patents, the first 2 of which we could collectively refer to as the Pokéball mechanic. The first patent is about aiming and firing some sort of item toward a character in a field, triggering a combat state. I think field here doesn't just mean a literal field, but something like a 3D virtual space. The second patent is about being able to capture creatures in the wild rather than just in a battle setting. So they've patented 3D Pokeballing, throwing items at wild creatures in a 3D environment and capturing them. The third patent is about riding creatures in an open world and transitioning between those creatures. Patents have to be really specific, demonstrably unique, and demonstrably belonging to the author that created it to be able to be patented. So the third one must be super specific, because there are tons of games where you ride creatures in an open world. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. Let's just focus on the Pokéball mechanic. So the brilliant Thor of Pirate Software did a video recently where he pointed out something really crucial about all this. Palworld was initially announced to the public, put in the public domain, in June 2021. Nintendo filed a patent for the Pokéball mechanic 6 months later, in December 2021. Nintendo used the game Pokémon Legends Arceus to file that patent, and Arceus would be released the following year. But, and this is the really crucial thing, the same company that made Palworld released another game, Craftopia, 2 years before Arceus in 2020. In Craftopia, you throw items at monsters in a 3D space to catch them, same as you do in Arceus. But Craftopia came out 2 years before the game Nintendo themselves used to file that patent. I think there's something incredibly shady about that. What's happened, it seems to me, is that Nintendo saw a game that was ripping off a bunch of their stuff, but they had no way to legally go after them. I think if they could have sued Palworld for such obvious rip-offs of their Pokemon designs, they would have done. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But they didn't sue them for that, which tells me they probably didn't fully have the legal recourse to do so. But Craftopia didn't just have the Pokeball mechanic. If you look at it, if you look at even just the trailer, you can immediately see that it's a knockoff of Breath of the Wild. The art style, the monster design, the combat, the boss fights, the music, I mean the whole thing, apart from the factory building, just screams Breath of the Wild. There's a part in one of the trailers where the main character uses a glider, which looks exactly like the one Link uses, and they put a shot of it in which looks exactly like some of the promotional material Nintendo used for Breath of the Wild. It's so blatantly obvious. There's even a staircrafting mechanic in it that seems like it's been lifted directly from Fortnite, but that's not Nintendo. Nintendo probably knew about Craftopia, but didn't have the full legal grounding to sue them for it. And Pocket Pair are also a Japanese company, so it would have been Nintendo on their home turf suing another Japanese company. So there wouldn't have been any complicated international law element to it at all. So there must have been a reason they didn't do it then, and aren't doing it to Palworld for their PAL designs now. Craftopia also didn't sell anywhere near as well as Palworld, so maybe they thought it wasn't worth the effort. But what they did was make sure that the next time Pocket Pair or anyone else did something like this, they'd be ready. They saw that Palworld was basically going to be Pokemon with guns, patented the Pokeball mechanic, and are now suing Palworld for using it, even though they had already done it in a game that came out 2 years before the game that Nintendo used to make the patent for it. Then, they weren't violating a patent because none existed. But now, thanks to Nintendo's actions since then, they're now actually breaking the law. But then, why is Nintendo only demanding $65,000 from them in this case? Well, they're probably doing it to set a legal precedent. In law, precedent means a decision made by a court which can then be used as an authority on which to decide other similar cases involving similar facts and similar issues. It's related to a legal doctrine called stare decisis, which in Latin means to stand by things decided. Stare decisis means that the law must be applied in the same way in cases involving the same facts and the same legal issues. You can't apply the law differently across two cases which are the same in nature. So if a court decides to apply the law in a particular way in a particular case, then the law should be applied in the same way in future cases involving the same facts and the same issues as that previous case. You have to stand by the things that were decided before. So if Nintendo can get a court to decide that Pocket Pair should pay them $65,000 for using their patented Pokeball mechanic, it means they will then have a legal precedent they can use in all future cases like this. If anyone tries to use their patented mechanics, they will have a court decision they can point to and say, in that case you decided this, so you have to decide the same thing again. And because they're not asking for a huge sum of money in the grand scheme of things, there's a fair chance that a judge might rule on it more easily than if they'd requested $65 million. And there's also a fair chance their opponent might just pay it to get the whole thing over with. Then Nintendo has the precedent for future legal battles. Now, as I said, I do think there's something incredibly shady about all this. Should companies be able to manufacture patents for things that have already been done by their competitors, just so they can sue them years later? We can disagree about the morality or legality of this particular case, but the real question underlying all this is whether companies should be able to patent game mechanics at all. Should someone be able to patent a game mechanic? Should a developer be able to take something they've made, whether it's a nemesis system or an arrow showing where your objective is, or a system where you throw items at monsters and catch them, and make it illegal for any other developer to use that system? Of course, there are arguments on both sides of this. Patenting itself has been a very controversial issue for basically the whole time it's existed. People who defend the patenting system argue that it encourages the open sharing of ideas. If you patent something, you have to publicly declare it and share that knowledge with the world. But then, once you have, no one's allowed to profit off it for a certain amount of time. This protects inventors from the possibility of not making any money from their ideas. If someone invents something, doesn't patent it, and then releases it, a competitor might figure out what they've done, replicate it, and make money off it, which could have gone to the person who actually invented the thing in the first place. Isn't that a bit unfair to the person who made it? They make this great thing which helps humanity and offers something useful to society, only to not get anything back in return, or at least make a lot less money than they would have done if they'd patented it. The downside to patenting is that if something gets patented for 20 years, that's 20 years of potential innovation and progress on that thing completely stalled in the public domain. If you put an invention into the public domain, people can then riff on it, do their own version of it, and improve it, or use it to do something different, or apply it somewhere, or in a way that the original inventor didn't see. All human progress is made by taking previous inventions and ideas and working from them. Patenting arguably hinders rather than helps this process. The patenting system can also be abused or work unfairly. Someone could invent something but not have the money to patent it. Or someone could make a patent just so they can sue their competitors for doing that thing. Either way, patenting only works for the people who have the money to do it. And as a system, it's always going to benefit the people that have the most money, who are most able to afford the legal fees that go along with patenting. But I think it's problematic to make big generalizations about the patenting system. Maybe there are some areas where it makes sense, although I'm open to being persuaded that patenting in general is a bad idea. But we're talking specifically about game mechanics, and I do think there is something really wrong with the idea of patenting game mechanics. The reason I think this is that patenting mechanics treats them merely as computerized processes rather than as artistic tools. Patents talk about game mechanics as digital things, computerized processes developers can point to and say, that's mine, I invented that thing, and no one else has done that in this exact way. But this fails to understand a very important part of what mechanics are in games and what they do. They are artistic tools that are part of an artistic, creative process. And it's therefore not good for humanity that we prohibit them from being used by others. Patenting game mechanics seems to me just as absurd as patenting a particular style of painting, a particular brushstroke, colour palette, or subject. Like if Salvador Dali had patented painting melting clocks, or a filmmaker had patented a particular camera shot, or a musician patented a particular chord. Imagine if Jimi Hendrix had patented tuning a guitar down a step and playing it upside down. In the art form of game design, mechanics are the equivalent of these types of things, and for the good of artistic freedom and innovation, they should be open to be used by whatever artist sees fit to use them. You could patent a particular type of camera so that no one else could make profit making or selling that type of camera. You could patent a particular recipe for making paint. You could patent a new type of guitar. But as for the particular techniques people use these things for, the styles, the motifs, the things they use them to do in order to produce art, those things should be off limits. Game mechanics, I think, are exactly this type of thing. It might suck if someone steals your invention and profits off it, if it's a light bulb or a telephone or whatever, but art works differently. Ultimately, the history of art is a history of people stealing and borrowing each other's ideas. That's how it works. There's a quote often attributed to Pablo Picasso which says, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." Whether he actually said this is disputed, but there is an actual quote from T.S. Eliot which expresses the same sentiment. He says, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different." You can't stop people in art from stealing each other's ideas because, in a sense, art is people stealing each other's ideas, and all art takes inspiration from what's come before it, repeating the things it finds worthwhile and taking these things in different directions, blending them with other things and ideas and taking them to new heights. All innovation, discovery and progress is built on and a product of the achievements of those who've come before us. As the great physicist Isaac Newton said in one of his letters, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." This is why patenting game mechanics seems perverse to me. It's basically a developer coming up with a really good idea and saying to the rest of the artistic world, "You're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to take direct inspiration from this. I don't want my idea to be part of this great artistic conversation of borrowing, iterating, and innovating." Patenting a mechanic is so hypocritical in this regard. Mechanics are made out of other mechanics. Shadow of Mordor's Nemesis system is built from other mechanics which other developers came up with, and which that system needed to be able to exist. Any developer that's ever patented a mechanic has borrowed mechanics from other developers in order to build their mechanics, only to then refuse to let other developers do that with their own creation. And in the gaming world, it seems like patenting mechanics is not always a benefit to those that patent them. The game Metroid, also Nintendo, inspired a whole genre of its own, with dozens, even hundreds of games which have copied its essential idea of having a semi-explorable map that becomes more explorable as you find items and power-ups that help you navigate it better. If Nintendo had patented that, that wouldn't have been allowed to happen. Or at least the process of iterating and improving on that formula would have had a 20-year delay in getting started. Metroid Dread came out a few years ago, and it's one of the most popular games in the franchise. But its success and the continued interest in the Metroid games and the Metroidvania genre is partially down to the fact that its core idea has been riffed on continuously by many other games, which has generated interest in the games that inspired the genre in the first place. So no, we should not let people patent game mechanics. It stifles creativity, is able to be exploited by the companies with the most money, is hostile to the free flourishing of art, fails to accord video games the artistic status they deserve, and is an insult to the developers whose mechanics have been used to build mechanics, which are now being patented. I'll be interested to see how the Palworld situation plays out, and what it means for the industry, but I do fundamentally believe that patenting game mechanics is wrong. Do you agree with me? Let me know in the comments what you think. We'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Do you think patenting game mechanics is okay? Do you think it's okay in some situations? Or do you agree with me that they're wrong, but for maybe a different reason? Do type in the comments what your response to this would be. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Breaking the Game, and we'll see you next time.